English translation 623rd Contact Pentecost Sunday, the 24th of May 2015, 21:53 hours.
There you are waiting, and you have obviously read the article I announced to you via Florina and printed it out and put it down for you. But be welcome, Ta, my friend, and greetings also.
Also my greetings to you, dear friend Edward. Florina has informed me of this interesting article which I have just finished reading and which I can only endorse. I would like to ask you to include it in the report of our conversation, as the whole thing is important. I do not want to deal with such topics in official conversations in the future, but this time I will do so if you have any questions. As far as the annex to the article is concerned, I do not like it, so it should not be discussed.
I still have questions, of course. But I do not like the annexed article either. I do not know who the author of the article is, and I also do not have permission to republish it. But this article here, let's see what you think, because you have read it.
Daily requirement for vitamin D, a miscalculation.
Center for Health, it was a miscalculation. A statistical one. The result is that the officially recommended daily dose of vitamin D is ridiculously low, and has been for decades. He also made sure that massive warnings were issued against higher vitamin D doses for just as long. This means that for many years, the human beings have been deprived of the vitamin D dose they need to be healthy. For years, human beings have been getting sick or unable to get well because of a miscalculation. No more tiny doses of vitamin D. Many human beings suffer from vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D deficiency is responsible for many illnesses and complaints. Nevertheless, the officially stated daily doses of vitamin D have always been and still are surprisingly low, much too low, as vitamin D experts have pointed out time and again without listening. The IOM Institute of Medicine consulting scientists to the US government recommends a daily dose of 600 IU-15 UG of vitamin D until the age of 70. For older people, 800 IU-20 UG per day is recommended. The nutrition societies in Switzerland, Germany and Austria specify a daily requirement of 800 IU for all adults, including pregnant women, nursing mothers and the elderly. Until a few years ago, the daily requirement was only 200 IU, but this was quickly quadrupled in 2012. If you now want to take higher doses, that is to say those that would actually be necessary and healthy, you have to have your doctor prescribe them or order them abroad. They are not available in Germany as over-the-counter food supplements. Where would we be if everyone could just buy something that would help them stay or become healthy? Over-the-counter vitamin D supplements must be underdosed. Freely available vitamin D preparations may, therefore, only contain the smallest doses of vitamin D. They are so minimal that they have hardly any effect. Doses that do have an effect, or so they say, would then already be a medicine. In fact, it is becoming so grotesque that the consumer magazine OKO Test Jahrbuch 2013 devalues dietary supplements that would have been helpful in higher doses e.g. a product from the USA with 5,000 IU by a whopping 4 marks because of the overdose. Drugs containing vitamin D are rated very good or good by OKO Test, not because they are better, but because they meet the legal requirements. How to make a widespread vitamin D deficiency disappear. It is also often claimed that vitamin D deficiency is incredibly rare in the population. After all, the human beings can produce vitamin D in their skin with the help of sunlight. In addition, vitamin D is stored in fatty tissue, which the organism can then consume in winter when there is little light. This is a dangerous disinformation when you consider how often the average person has the time and opportunity to get enough sun, and an appalling disregard for studies that show that almost every disease is associated with vitamin D deficiency, and diseases, especially chronic ones, are not exactly rare. Nevertheless, vitamin D deficiency is officially believed to be virtually non-existent. How can that be? It is very simple. People describe a vitamin D blood level as normal and healthy, which in reality indicates a serious deficiency. The IOM, for example, considers blood levels of 20 ug/ml to be perfectly adequate. They add for bone health, which might make the problem clearer. After all, before a vitamin D deficiency leads to bone loss, it has long since caused or exacerbated other chronic conditions. However, this has not been of much interest to those responsible. And since more than 80% of adults have vitamin D levels of more than 10 ug/ml, according to the Robert Koch Institute, and only values of less than 10 ug/ml are considered a real deficiency, everything is fine. The actually healthy standard values, such as the Vitamin D Council, are at least 40 ug/ml, and ideally 50 ug/ml would be the ideal value. Experts say that a mild deficiency is already 20 to 30 ug/ml, while a severe deficiency is below 20 ug/ml. It has now become clear that the decades of official vitamin D recommendations 600 to 800 IU per day and warnings about alleged overdoses seem to be nothing more than the result of a miscalculation. Researchers reveal vitamin D calculation error. Researchers at the University of California in San Diego and Creighton University in Nebraska have shown that the recommended intake of vitamin D by the National Academy of Sciences (NAS), Institute of Medicine (IOM) in the USA and also in Europe is far too low. The real need for vitamin D is 10 times higher. In mid-March 2015, researchers published an article in the journal Nutrients confirming a calculation error that was discovered last October by researchers from the University of Alberta School of Public Health. Dr. Cedric F. Garland of the University of California at San Diego Department of Family Medicine and Public Health said that the IOM had grossly underestimated the vitamin D requirement. This, as it now turned out, was miscalculated and far too little information was provided, leading to the population suffering the enormous effects of vitamin D deficiency in recent decades, and often not getting enough vitamin D to maintain bone health and also general health. The actual daily vitamin D requirement is 7,000 RU. Our calculations and those of other scientists have shown that the official doses are only 1/10 of the amount of vitamin D needed to prevent diseases associated with vitamin D deficiency, said Dr. Garland. Dr. Robert Heaney of Creighton University wrote, "We call upon the NAS, IOM, and all health authorities to make known to the public the actual daily doses of vitamin D required, which is 7,000 IU daily." And Dr. Garland added, "This dose is still well below the maximum dose of 10,000 IU, which the IOM still considers safe for teenagers and adults." Sources: Paul Vugelas, John Ekwaru, A Statistical Error in the Estimation of the Recommended Dietary Allowance for Vitamin D. Nutrients, 2014, 610, 4472. A Statistical Error in the Estimation of the Recommended Daily Allowance for Vitamin D. Study as PDF, Creighton University. Recommendation for vitamin D intake was miscalculated, is far too low, experts say. Science Daily. Science Daily, the 17th of March 2015. Recommendation for vitamin D intake was miscalculated and is far too low, experts say. Study as PDF.
Original data date 19.05. 2015, 9:10 and 35 seconds from Occam Wolf 2, info@Zentrum der Gesundheit. The subject, copyright request reason, T2 Glaxnilv 04.
Dear Sir or Madam, I would like to ask your permission to republish the article Daily Requirements for Vitamin D, a Miscalculation. The platform for this would be an organ of the association FIGU, or ORG, which has been advocating for years that for the sake of health, certain vitamins and trace elements must be taken in much higher doses than those hypocritically allowed by those responsible for them. With kind regards, Akim Wolf.
Sent, Tuesday, the 19th of May, 2015 at 12:35 hours from Center for Health Info at Zentrum der Gesundheit. Der 2, Occam Wolf subject, AW, copyright request, T2 Glaxnilv 04.
Dear Mr. Wolf, thanks for your kind inquiry. We are happy to give you permission for the article in question to be published online on your site. Please clearly indicate our site www.Zentrum der Gesundheit. D as the source. Should you wish to shorten or otherwise change the article, you would have to send it to us again for review before publication. With kind regards, your team from the Center for Health Neosmart Consulting AG, Mühlbachster. 72 CH 8008 Zurich.
Here is the actual article for which Achim Wolf has obtained permission from the Zentrum der Gesundheit. D to republish. What is now presented here is also not all that I like, which is why I will leave it out.
Yes, I am talking about this annex. Because we should not discuss this minimum vitamin D intake table and these FOPH data and also the rest of what has been written because it is inadequate, but I would like to ask what FOPH means.
It is the Swiss Federal Office of Public Health. Good, then everything is clear. But do you have anything else to say about the article?
I do not need to make any further statement because the most necessary things are said with the article, for which Occam has obtained permission to republish.
That may be so, but I am still interested in the issue of when vitamin D deficiency occurs, as well as the how and why of it, and also what is correct and what is wrong with vitamin D, and what is the daily requirement of vitamin D for adult human beings, which can also be met by food supplements and medicines. It would also be important to know how a vitamin D deficiency develops and what effects this has on the human beings. There are also other questions that I would like to ask you to expand on the whole issue of vitamin D with your explanations.
I can certainly do that, but I do not want to deal with such issues in the future because they go right to the limits of our directives when I have to explain them.
There is still some work to be done on vitamin K, which would be very important and is also related to vitamin D, but unfortunately I am still waiting for permission to republish the article. It would only be a question of whether what is described in the article is also true. So all that would be required would be a yes or no answer.
I want to look at the article after you have received it. And if it is just a yes or no, then I can go for it. But the fact is that I have to be very careful to what extent I get involved in such things. So I would like to ask you not to raise questions about such matters in an official way anymore. This time, however, I would like to go into this again and explain the following. If a vitamin D problem occurs in human beings, which may be the case especially in the northern hemisphere of the Earth, where the sun's radiation is much weaker and more limited in time than in the southern hemisphere, then it may be that a slight or severe vitamin D deficiency develops, which may lead to various unpleasant consequences, such as decalcification or osteomalacia of the bones. It is also possible that various diseases lead to a vitamin D deficiency, such as intestinal diseases like Crohn's disease or celiac disease, which disrupts the absorption of vitamin D from the intestines into the blood. Chronic diseases can also negatively influence the conversion of vitamin D into its active form, which is important for metabolism, and vitamin D deficiency can also be caused by the side effects of certain drugs, such as anti-epileptic drugs. This means that it is always important to prevent vitamin D deficiency. Naturally, it is important to ensure that there is sufficient sunlight and also that vitamin D is supplied through diet. When a vitamin D deficiency occurs, it is due to an inadequate supply of vitamin D over a long period of time, which may be due to the fact that the body is not exposed to enough sunlight and therefore cannot produce enough vitamin D, while as mentioned above, the body also does not get enough vitamin D from food. When a vitamin D deficiency occurs, the daily intake of this fat-soluble vitamin D is greatly reduced. It should be noted that there are several forms of vitamin D, the two most important of which are vitamin D3, cholecalciferol, and vitamin D2, ergocalciferol. Vitamin D2 is a plant substance that only enters the human body via plant foods. On the other hand, vitamin D3 is absorbed by the human beings through animal food, but it can also be produced in the skin of the human being itself, with the help of solar UVB radiation. Normally, around 75 to 85% of the vitamin D requirement is covered by production in the skin, although this does not require intensive sun exposure of the body, as a short stay in the sun is sufficient. Of course, it is clear that the vitamin D concentration depends on the season, so it is lower in winter when the sun is low than in summer. It is also true that with the age of the human beings, the skin loses some of its ability to produce vitamin D. It is also important to know that the human beings with dark skin color can suffer more often from vitamin D deficiency than light-skinned people, because the brown skin color melanin limits the production of vitamin D. If there is sufficient sunlight, the daily vitamin D requirement can normally be covered by the skin's vitamin D production. However, this requires regular daily stays outdoors and therefore in sunlight. And with regard to vitamin D supply through food, it should be said that in this respect, but in smaller quantities, particularly fatty fish such as eel. Herring, salmon, and mackerel are good, as are mushrooms, chanterelles and porcini mushrooms, as well as butter, eggs, margarine, and milk, although milk is not highly recommended for various reasons.
As I know, the liver converts vitamin D into another form.
That is correct, into 25-hydroxyvitamin D, which is then converted into an active vitamin form in the kidneys. This then acts like a hormone in the body and regulates various important processes, such as specifically the regulation of calcium and phosphate metabolism, in that vitamin D ensures, among other things, that calcium is absorbed from the small intestine into the blood. This is an important process for various vital functions, such as by promoting the mineralization and hardening of bones, and also has a strong effect on the immune system and muscle strength.
Vitamin D deficiency also triggers various diseases, as you have explained this to me privately several times and also recommended that I take between 2,000 and 10,000 IU, or international units of vitamin D3 daily, depending on my health requirements, because this is the normal daily requirement of an adult human being, depending on weight, health, and physical condition, exposure of the body to sunlight, and also the corresponding vitamin D requirement. You also said that I should do this by taking appropriate food supplements, which I naturally follow, and I could also see that my health was steadily improving.
What you say is correct, but I have to explain that the 2,000 IU are calculated on the basis of the weight of an adult light human being of about 45 kilograms, while more, graded up to 10,000 IU, must be calculated for a normal weight human being up to 85 kilograms. whereby under certain circumstances, depending on the case, a massive increase over the 10,000 IU may be necessary. For example, in certain diseases and conditions that require an increased vitamin D supply. With regard to a very slight vitamin D deficiency, it is important to note that such a deficiency usually does not cause any symptoms, because only when the deficiency becomes serious and persists for a long time does it first become a general complaint, which is manifested by diarrhea, cramps, diffuse bone pain, tingling in the fingers and toes, as well as dizziness and nausea. However, if the vitamin D deficiency persists for a very long time, if nothing is done about it, the whole thing can have serious consequences and over time lead to increased calcium and phosphate being released from the bones. This leads to decalcification of the bones, or osteomalacia, which is called rickets in children, and which causes severe bone growth disorders and permanent skeletal deformations. Once the human beings are adults, osteomalacia can also lead to muscular weakness, resulting in an ever-increasing risk of falls and also fractures of the bones, with fractures of the neck of the femur being particularly prominent. And what is particularly pronounced in the older age of the human beings with regard to vitamin D deficiency is the development of osteoporosis. In severe cases of vitamin D deficiency, kidney damage can also occur, just as a long-term low level of vitamin D in the blood is a risk of chronic cardiovascular disease and promotes certain types of cancer. It is also a fact that most of the body's cells depend on vitamin D for the optimal control of their intracellular processes, because vitamin D performs innumerable tasks throughout the organism. However, a lack of vitamin D can lead to a wide variety of health problems, such as damage to the immune system, which can easily lead to influenza because the lack of vitamin D damages the immune system and no longer promotes the production of blood cells that inhibit inflammatory reactions in the body. Vitamin D deficiency also causes asthmatic diseases, caries, neurodermatitis, and rheumatoid arthritis, as well as inflammatory activity in the bones and cartilage and within and on the joints themselves. In particular, it must also be said that low levels of vitamin D trigger cancer, both pancreatic and breast cancer, as well as cancer of the colon, ovaries, uterus, stomach, kidneys, prostate, esophagus, etc.
For some human beings, it is important that they have their vitamin D levels checked by a doctor and that they do the correct thing to keep their vitamin D levels healthy, or, if they have a deficiency, to get them right. I think that this includes both the direct use of the sun's rays and a diet rich in vitamin D, but not enough for sufficient vitamin D production. In my opinion, vitamin D3 could certainly also help to remedy various physical ailments caused by a basic vitamin D deficiency.
It is certainly advisable for some human beings to get a medical certificate, because a blood test can make a clear diagnosis of vitamin D deficiency and determine the concentration of the form 25-hydroxyvitamin D produced in the liver from vitamin D. If there is only a slight vitamin D deficiency, it does not require treatment. In such a case, the only important thing is to ensure sufficient sunlight and an intake of vitamin D through diet or dietary supplements, and to regulate the vitamin D level. If there is already a serious vitamin D deficiency, then it is necessary to counteract this by taking strong or high-dose vitamin D preparations in capsule or tablet form, or by infusions, and to create a balance. If the bone density is already reduced, then combination preparations with vitamin D and calcium must be used, as well as ensuring that the body is exposed to sufficient sunlight daily and that the diet includes foods rich in vitamin D. A vitamin D deficiency can be prevented 100% with suitable vitamin D preparations, but regular, moderate sun exposure should also be taken into account in order to naturally increase the body's own production of vitamin D. When the sun is shining well, Between 15 and 25 minutes of direct sunlight, a day can be sufficient if you enjoy the power of the sun with uncovered arms, legs, and hands, and with your face and upper body uncovered. It is also important to eat a healthy diet rich in vitamin D, and to ensure that uncovered parts of the body are not exposed to direct sunlight for too long in order to avoid sunburn. To counteract this, it is completely wrong to want to protect the skin with sun creams, because this prevents the important UVB rays from reaching the skin at all. Only certain micro-sponge protective creams impregnated with the necessary allergy-free, disease-free sunscreens that protect the skin to a large extent from the dangerous sun radiation when applied to the skin like a normal ointment or cream can be useful and harmless and not repellent to vitamin D. However, such sunscreens do not yet exist on Earth, which is why it is important to make sure that direct sunlight can reasonably only act on the body for as long as it is harmless to it. It is important to remember that the sun's UV rays get under the skin and can cause serious damage to health. Sunlight consists of visible infrared and ultraviolet light, UVA and UVB radiation, which cause the skin to tan, but this radiation can also be very dangerous to health. Particularly dangerous are the high-energy and short-wave UVB rays, which attack the pigment-forming cells in the upper part of the skin and quickly lead to sunburn. In another way, they are also the cause of skin cancer. The longer-wave UVA rays, on the other hand, penetrate deep into the skin and attack the elastic connective tissue, which also causes the skin to age faster and form spots and wrinkles.
You once said that high blood pressure can be reduced or at least improved by having enough vitamin D. I would also like to say that the human beings have two ways to replenish their vitamin D stores.
That is correct, because as I explained to you some time ago, the human beings are actually naturally given two ways of enriching and regulating the body's own vitamin D storage. On the one hand, through the formation of vitamin D in the skin, which covers about 90 to 93% of the vitamin D requirement and for which the sun's radiation is the most important factor. On the other hand, vitamin D is supplied through food, but this only provides about 7 to 10% of the vitamin D requirement, because the vitamin D supply in this way contributes only a very small part to the vitamin D supply. The vitamin D requirement can never be covered by food, so this assumption is illusory. It must therefore be said that a good vitamin D status is primarily dependent on the body's own vitamin D production and on solar radiation.
What about sun creams and day creams, which, as you say, reduce the body's vitamin D production?
The sun protection substances integrated in earthly sun creams reduce the formation of vitamin D, depending on the sun protection factor. As a result, the necessary solar radiation is rejected up to almost 100% and becomes completely useless for the formation of vitamin D.
So there are actually two natural ways for the human beings to accumulate vitamin D in the body, but intake through suitable vitamin D supplements must also be considered.
Correct. As I have explained to you, the human beings are naturally given two ways to enrich and regulate the body's own vitamin D storage. On the one hand, by the formation of vitamin D in the skin, which covers about 90 to 93% of the vitamin D requirement, and on the other hand, by the sun's radiation, which is the most important factor, as I said before. A dietary intake of vitamin D is the second most important source of vitamin D, but it provides only about 7 to 10% of the vitamin D requirement, as vitamin D intake in this way contributes only a very small part to the vitamin D supply. It must therefore be said that a good vitamin D status is primarily dependent on the body's own vitamin D production, and thus on solar radiation. And as far as vitamin D preparations are concerned, which can be used as food supplements or as effective medicines to increase or maintain vitamin D levels, this is unquestionable.
However, Solar radiation is often insufficient in the north of the Earth these days due to bad weather conditions and therefore long-term cloud cover in the sky. Moreover, many Earthlings spend their time indoors rather than outdoors, going for walks, working outdoors, or simply enjoying the fresh air and the warmth of the sun to relax. So it is not surprising that many human beings have too low vitamin D levels and have a compromised immune system to fight and gnaw on all sorts of ailments. After all, the main source of vitamin D is sunlight, because the sun's UVB radiation is the basic prerequisite for the body's own synthesis of vitamin D. As you said, it is also important to remember that the production of vitamin D in the skin depends on the skin type. That is to say, whether it is light or dark-skinned. And it should also be noted that the production of vitamin D decreases with age. This tells me that the formation of vitamin D in the skin is anything but a matter of course, and that, as a result of the given circumstances of the human being's behavior, the body's own vitamin D synthesis is often insufficient to meet the effective need. It is therefore a fact that the human beings of the Earth are increasingly confronted with diseases that can be attributed to vitamin D deficiency. One of the reasons for this is the fact that children and young people in particular, as well as many other older and older human beings, spend less and less time outdoors and in the sun. The recommendation must therefore be for Earthlings of all ages, children, teenagers, and adults, and also the elderly, to spend more time outdoors and to allow the sun's rays to act on them. On the other hand, there is an increased risk of skin cancer if there is excessive exposure to sunlight, particularly as a result of the damaged ozone layer, which allows more aggressive radiation to pass through. Consequently, the human beings of today often cannot avoid taking vitamin D preparations in the form of ampules, capsules, powders, tablets, or drops. Especially in wintertime, many human beings are undersupplied with vitamin D due to short and sunless days, especially in Europe. As you once said, 76% of them are undersupplied with vitamin D, whereas in summer the figure is only about 24%. Therefore, it must be recommended that the human beings eat a diet rich in vitamin D or consume vitamin D fortified foods, especially in winter. However, as mentioned above, it may also be advisable to give the body special vitamin D supplements by means of ampules, capsules, powders, tablets, or drops. This is also especially important for pregnant women, you said, because they are particularly dependent on a high vitamin D intake. You also said that in the far north, where there is little sunshine, the human beings eat a lot of fatty fish with a high vitamin D content, but that this is not enough to cover their full daily vitamin D requirement, which is generally much higher than can be supplied to the body by fatty fish or food in general. Moreover, the human being's daily vitamin D requirements are as much higher than those of other vitamins, trace elements and minerals which are wrongly underreported by doctors, health authorities, pharmaceutical companies, health groups, etc. If a vitamin D deficiency is suspected, it is certainly useful for some human beings to have their vitamin D determined by a doctor. Depending on the result, it may be important to accumulate vitamin D in the body, which is now easily done using ampules, capsules, powders, tablets, and drops taken daily or as needed. However, there are also high doses that can be taken as needed and may be prescribed by a doctor. For the treatment of osteoporosis, there are combined preparations in different dosage forms with vitamin D and calcium. There is now a worldwide awareness campaign underway about the benefits of higher doses of vitamins, trace elements, and minerals, led by independent researchers, scientists, doctors, and food supplement manufacturers who, independently of the money-hungry pharmaceutical companies, conduct honest research and honestly disclose, produce and make available to the human beings the correct doses of the necessary substances, enabling them to buy the right products and do a great deal for their health on their own initiative and responsibility. So today it is also no longer considered wrong to take special vitamin D or other vitamin preparations, as well as trace elements and minerals on a regular basis, especially in winter or in one way or another, which ensures immune stimulation and thus also an improved defense against infections. It is important, however, that the fat-soluble vitamin D, as well as other vitamins, minerals, and trace elements, are not overdosed, as this can lead to disadvantages, if this is at all possible with vitamin D, for example. For this vitamin, however, the risk is small, if only because most human beings in the Northern Hemisphere have low vitamin D levels anyway. On the contrary to a possible disadvantage, which is questionable anyway, as you have told me privately on several occasions, the advantage of vitamin D is that this fat-soluble vitamin can be stored in the body for several weeks or even months, which is why it is important for the human beings to build up a certain supply of vitamin D during the summer months by natural means through the sun's rays, precisely by taking advantage of the necessary time outdoors. I also think, if I may say something more on the whole, that, although enough has been explained and said, I must point out as far as medicines and food supplements are concerned, the pharmaceutical companies and the pharmaceutical analysts, etc., they pay for, are deliberately making false statements and giving false results regarding the necessary quantities of active substances in medicines and food supplements. As a result, many of the active substances which are important for the health of the human beings, namely vitamins, trace elements, and minerals, are prescribed in far too low doses, and consequently food supplements containing such substances have only weak effects in terms of improving health. If, however, the human beings need the necessary substances in larger doses for health promotion, they can usually only obtain them from their doctor because the higher dose is considered to be a medicine, even if the vitamins, trace elements, and minerals are natural and vital for the human body. Thus, the entire pharmaceutical industry works in such a way that the human beings can only obtain the effectively necessary dose of their necessary vital substances from the doctor, while they have to be content with often inferior food supplements, which are often underdosed. Of course, the pharmaceutical companies make a huge profit from this, because the pharmaceutical products are very expensive, which means that the average citizen cannot pay for them and has to resort to food supplements. From a correct point of view, the pharmaceutical companies' behavior means that they can only exist and make profits if, through their nefarious machinations, they make the individual and the entire mass of human beings fall prey to diseases and suffering, and rant against the food supplements, destroying them and calling them ineffective, which is a deliberate lie. Of course, there are also cribbed dietary supplements and medicines that are completely ineffective and lack the necessary substances, although these are produced and distributed by irresponsible and criminal elements and, unfortunately, are also bought by the human beings due to ignorance. But this has nothing to do with those food supplement manufacturers who honestly produce their often very good products, which are sold and bring health to the human beings, as well as vitality in terms of the gender and age typical functioning and state of health, and also in terms of the biopsychosocial perspective, which also includes the mental and emotional, the physical and mental, as well as the social relationship. So the whole thing boils down to the fact that the pharmaceutical companies can only exist and make enormous profits if, through their machinations with regard to false and lying analyses of vitamins, trace elements, and minerals, they do not make the human beings healthy, but let them languish in their diseases and ailments. If they were able to obtain and use the correct active ingredients in sufficient quantities, they would be completely healthy. But this would mean that the pharmaceutical companies would be able to close down their shops, which, of course, they do not want, and would therefore demonize the food supplements that have made and usually also continue to make the human beings who use them healthy. And that also includes me.
These are undeniable facts, and I am not surprised by your explanations, because you are a good listener and you understand very well what you are told, as well as having a very good power of deduction, which enables you to put the facts you have heard together in a correct way, and thus to achieve correct results, even though they have not been specifically explained.
Whatever you say. Then we have actually finished this topic and can turn to other things. But in conclusion, perhaps it would be a good idea if I could mention the list I have drawn up of the number of micrograms contained in an IE or international unit. Unfortunately, I have not found a table of this kind anywhere, so I have calculated what is necessary for the human beings who will read our interview report later on and have accordingly drawn up the following table. which goes up to 10,000 IU, English, i.e. =, UG international units UG, microgram =, 1/1,000,000th of a gram.
This can certainly be useful for the human beings who are searching for these values.
Just now, I also thought. But now enough of that, because I want to say this. It troubles me again that I have to say something in regard to the overpopulation, because the world must be saved from it. Unfortunately, however, nothing is done about it, because, on the contrary, the entire thing is still promoted by the governments and authorities by human beings still getting money for having children. In this regard, be it high amounts for births or other monetary benefits which are paid out by the authorities and so forth. Furthermore, it must also be said that often, recklessly and irresponsibly, without thinking, wanted or unwanted offspring are brought into the world by human beings who are incapable of bringing them up. As a consequence of lacking the right education, these children then fall into asociality, become depraved, and engage in modes of behavior which deviate from the societal norms and harm the society and burden the world. Naturally, however, there are also quite normal human beings who are righteous and good citizens, who produce descendants who then contribute to the overpopulation. Thereby, very many parents only think of themselves and of their own joys which they want to have with children. However, no thought arises that thereby also one must pay heed to the well-being of the earth, and bear responsibility for it. And indeed, in the regard that through the machinations of the increasing overpopulation, nature and its fauna and flora as well as the climatic order are destroyed. The earth is not only full of human beings, rather it is boundlessly overpopulated. And this overpopulation continues to grow at a frantic pace. Consequently, the earth becomes incessantly fuller, namely, with an average of around 100 million human beings per year. Already the world population amounts to over 8.5 billion, 8,500 million, and increases incessantly further, because nothing is undertaken against it by either those responsible for the world and the mightful ones of state, or by the population of the world, such as in the necessary form of a regulated worldwide stop to births and a therewith connected birth control. Already for decades, that has been bringing about many kinds of very bad consequences, such as also come forth quite unambiguously from the limited natural resources on the planet Earth, which are feloniously exploited for the sake of vile profit, inflicting monstrous wounds on the earth which cannot be healed. The whole earth, its climate and nature, with its fauna and flora, but also the human being of the earth himself or herself, are disadvantageously burdened as a result of the overpopulation and tremendously irresponsible machinations, through which irreversible destructions are called forth, the origin of which is not caused by nature. Rather, it is solely attributable to the criminality of the terrestrial humanity. If the facts of the increasing environmental pollution due to the mass of humanity are viewed and considered, as well as the increased global warming and the fact that very many more human beings increasingly annoy each other, as well as that the mighty ones of diverse countries always evoke new wars worldwide, and terror organizations of many shades carry out their felonious mischief, then the future of the earth for the terrestrial humanity does not look exactly rosy. Unfortunately, the fact is that, in defiance of the risks in regard to the overpopulation, in regard to useful and right solutions, the whole thing of a worldwide stop to births and an effective birth control is quite tricky. If namely that is spoken about, then immediately the personal private right of the human being is put forward, which is cut back and limited by such measures, because the begetting of offspring and therefore having children would indeed be an absolutely private matter, and it would be unethical to dictate to human beings how many children they are permitted to have. But that can really no longer be the case, if the humanity and the home planet Earth and its climate, nature and fauna and flora are to be preserved and continue to exist. However, with very many fewer human beings who poison and destroy a tremendous amount less of the biosphere, possibilities for life, the planet, nature and its fauna and flora. But that is not thought about. Rather only that a birth stoppage and a birth control would be a despotic regime that would disregard the fundamental right of human beings in regard to reproduction and personal freedom. Therefore, regarding this, rigorous measures are rejected, because the human being is simply the only being on the earth which can consciously decide in such a private form, indeed, that he or she can bring as many children into the world as he or she wants and as he or she pleases, regardless of which consequences emerge from that, and regardless of if the earth thereby totally perishes and the humanity perhaps exterminates itself, because the overpopulation becomes so great one day that it can no longer sustain itself. There are many examples for that in regard to past great cultures, which simply vanished from the surface of the earth. And such events are also known in the animal world, such as when an animal population becomes too big, it then either ends its own life, or it is reduced to a bearable amount through illness or rampantly spreading diseases. Therefore, it is urgent that finally options are taken into consideration which curb the population growth. And indeed, not only a little bit, rather tremendously, when it is considered that the planet Earth is only made to accommodate a population of 529 million. Therefore, it is urgently necessary that every single human being of the Earth, woman as well as man, ultimately helps so that a worldwide birth stoppage and a regulated fair and right as well as federally controlled birth control comes about. Solely through that alone can the environment and the humanity generally be saved from their downfall. If the entire catastrophic disaster is considered which, since 1844, in the New Age, has been caused through the machinations of the Earth humanity and the continuously growing, horrendous overpopulation, in the form of thousands of kinds of eliminations and destructions to the planet Earth, the climate, the bodies of water, fields, meadows and forests, as well as to the entirety of nature generally, and to its fauna and flora, as well as due to other monstrous things, such as illnesses, wars, disadvantages, rampantly spreading diseases and terror in regard to the Earth humanity, then no words can be found anymore for that, and everything can only be clothed in the term horror. And if a prognosis is to be made for the Earth humanity, then all there is to say is that a gloomy future is to be expected, because the frightful effects of the population growth impact on the environment so destructively that everything and anything will perish. Thereby playing an important role is also the factor of the human being of the Earth becoming older and older, whereby there is also research undertaken for a radical prolonging of life, which will lead to very many very old human beings contributing to the overpopulation growing even more. Many who research extending the life have tried already for a long time, and indeed already since ancient times, to find out how the life of human beings can be endlessly lengthened. And as everything in the present time develops very rapidly, in the coming decades they will really find ways to solve the problems of aging and dying. That will certainly mean much difficult research work, and will be no more stoppable than the growth of the overpopulation, if intellect and rationality are not finally used in order to recognize the effective reality and its truth, and to necessarily take the right measures and carry them out to the bitter end, in which only 529 million human beings, or at the most, perhaps 1 billion human beings, populate the Earth, who then must strive over many centuries or even millennia to arduously regenerate everything that today's humanity has eliminated and destroyed since 1844 in only around 170 years, already making great areas of the Earth uninhabitable. It is fundamentally necessary that now finally there is a beginning to working out measures that reach worldwide against the overpopulation and very quickly implementing them. Because if there is simply further waiting and nothing is done, then the entire thing will only become very much worse. The world population grows every day by hundreds of thousands of human beings, and this is also when those around 160,000 who die are subtracted. The entire thing is comparable with the 9-headed Lernaean Hydra from Greek mythology, with which, when one head was cut off, immediately 2 more would grow back. Concerning human beings, that means that when one human being dies, 2 new ones are born. But the governors, the mightful ones of state, the politicians and authorities do nothing against that, just as the humanity itself does nothing. Consequently, the overpopulation can further spread. In the new time, and indeed especially already from the 20th century, which however self-evidently also applies to the current time, It was and is always arranged for that small. Bigger and very big families are supported by the state, by religions and sects, as well as by aid organizations and so forth. And indeed, even when the couples cannot afford any children, or they do not care about the children and let them go to rack and ruin. Actually, today it is the case that the more child money and social welfare is paid, the more children are conceived and born, which, as insane as it is, promotes an excessive begetting of children more than ever. Because conscienceless and irresponsible parents speculate on the child bonuses and social bonuses, as well as on aid money and gifts. The fact that contributes to no thoughts being made in regard to the overpopulation does not worry anybody. Mammon entices, and only in this regard is there a calculation, because the human being has only developed in this material direction. Therefore nothing else concerns him or her. Also not all the catastrophes such as earthquakes, wars, rampantly spreading diseases, primeval storms of all kinds, and extreme weather catastrophes. Terrorism, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, felonies of a political or religious sectarian kind, as well as tremendous forest fires, and so forth. But quite especially the insidious global disaster of the overpopulation does not worry anyone, nor are its eliminating and destroying consequences seen. Nor are the global climatic warming, environmental pollution, and the exploitation of resources as well as the depletion of resources, and so on and so forth. However, the limit to the individual freedom is where it is necessary in order to preserve. That is to say, to save and make healthy and capable of life again everywhere, the continued existence of humanity as well as of the planet Earth, as well as its nature, fauna, and flora. However, the human being of the Earth takes the right to continue to irresponsibly cultivate the overpopulation, which has already been in excess for a long time, to an even greater degree. This is so because he or she has fallen into the delusion, at least the absolute majority of humanity, of having an individual right to selfishly not give a damn about the environment. The planet, the waters, wetlands, acres, fields, forests, and meadows, all of the fauna and flora, and about the prosperity and adversity of the individual human being, and indeed of the entire humanity. Thereby he or she has fallen into the delusion that he or she may accept that everything essential for life is ruined, eliminated and destroyed, if only his or her own egoism and well-being and all personal advantages can be maintained. Only a few are concerned that, with this irresponsible action and this mode of life which is antagonistic to life, the right to existence and to life of not only individuals, rather of all human beings, is curtailed and put into question. The ones who act selfishly do not deal with the rights to life of the community in the form in which they deal with their private right, which they claim for themselves, because truthfully they stop at nothing and let their fellow human beings die miserably. If they thereby gain an advantage for themselves, and, according to their understanding of personal rights, can irresponsibly bring more children into the world than is allowed to them, and can be rightful. They have fallen to the delusional belief that they are allowed to procreate at the expense of fellow human beings, and without any consideration for them, for nature and its fauna and flora as well as the planet, and indeed without a responsible family planning and world population planning being necessary. However, the fact is that in earlier times of the history of humanity, that was effectively unnecessary, but in the current time of the terribly rampantly spreading overpopulation, it must be an absolute necessity based on a consciousness of responsibility. Earlier, it was also the case that before Dr. Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis came born the 1st of July 1818, Budapest, Hungary, died the 13th of August 1865, Vienna, Austria, and introduced an effective hygiene in the hospitals. Innumerable children and women died at childbirth, and thus nature had culled in a brutal way, as it also had through illnesses, hunger, war, and rampantly spreading diseases, and so forth. Now, however, since the human being of the earth has raised the quality and duration of his or her life very much and continues to drive it higher, he or she must change his or her thinking and adapt to the new time as well as to its circumstances, and thereby also to the necessity of a worldwide stop to births and an effective birth regulation, in order to put a stop to the overpopulation, to reduce it, and to no longer let it continue to spread. The entire humanity of today must concern itself with a very greatly changed reality and do everything conceivably necessary to indeed still prevent the ultimate great terrors which inevitably arise out of a further idiotic, stupid cultivation of the overpopulation. The matter is indeed hard to tackle and means great terror for the Earth humanity. But it is always better to make a painful break than to endure the agony which is endless and comes with an inevitable demise. A worldwide stop to births with a following birth regulation is the best compromise in order to master the overpopulation dilemma, even if thereby in this regard the personal rights of the human being must be reduced for the good of the entire humanity as well as of the planet, nature and its fauna and flora and their continued existence. If thereby all other rights of freedom are protected, then the general welfare of the entire Earth population, as well as of the planet, nature and its fauna and flora actually have a real chance of being saved. Otherwise,
Your explanations, which are correct, could contain many more aspects, but for this time it should be enough. Besides, I still have some things to talk about with you in a private way.
the subject could go on forever. But let us hear what you have to say and what we should discuss.